All right, so hello everyone. Welcome back to the Bicycle for the EO Mind podcast. Today I have the great honor of speaking with Nathan Schneider, who is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Media Economies Design Lab. His most recent book is Governable Spaces, Democratic Design for Online Life. How are you today, Nathan?
Good. It's good to be with you.
So just as sort of a way of kind of introducing maybe yourself and this conversation, could you speak to us about your journey in exploring the intersection of technology and advocating for change in the economy and society, and particularly from involvement, direct or indirect involvement in online communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know where to begin, but one version of it is, about a little over a decade ago, I was working as a social movement reporter, and I was just seeing the importance of digital networks in movements for social change, and also saw the ways in which those networks were really not serving the people that were relying on them and the movements that were relying on them. And it seemed to me critical, and many others, to rethink how our digital networks are owned and governed. This pulled me deeper into a much wider tradition and legacy of the cooperative movement, of shared ownership in other kinds of forms. And so over the years since, I've been deeply involved in cooperatives on and offline, employee ownership on and offline, and efforts to build democratic practices also into online communities of many sorts, even if they don't involve shared ownership in the familiar sense. So to me, the challenge has really become, how can we insert opportunities for democracy and power sharing into our lives wherever we can?
The Buy Twitter campaign is just so much, for me, at least personally, it's sort of a zeitgeist moment of like, for my thinking about like, what is this intersection of the technologies that we use, relying upon them, as you say, and like, do they serve us? What is the governance aspects of that?
Yeah, in 2016, a group of us who were involved in what became known as the movement around platform cooperativism. So we've been organizing conferences, and we've been supporting startups trying to build tech companies with cooperative ownership, owned and governed by the workers or the users. A group of us saw a danger with Twitter, a company that has always kind of been uncomfortable in its identity as a company. So we started with a petition campaign, ended up actually doing a shareholder proposal at Twitter that would ask the company to explore options for democratizing the ownership of the company. But in the meantime, the campaign did get some attention and introduce the possibility, that horizon of shared ownership to a bunch of people who might not otherwise have encountered it. And so in that respect, it was successful, though unfortunately we weren't able to preempt what happened later on.
Yeah, and so thank you so much for walking us through that story.
It was a pretty small group of us organizing who had developed a lot of trust in the cooperative movement already and knew each other, and then drew in some other participants and organizers as well. So we were really kind of drawing on networks that we had been forming already. And one outgrowth of it that emerged in terms of new digital communities that really came after the shareholder meeting was, there was always this conversation about whether we should really be trying to fix Twitter or actually just build something new. And so there was always that kind of dual strategy at work. And we ended up taking on the latter approach. And a group who had been involved in organizing broke off and formed a new cooperative called Social.coop, which is a server that runs Mastodon, which is an open source decentralized social network. And at the time it was very small. So we were set up this community and we're using it and we're running it. And it was still like not something you could really use every day, but we kept it going. That, now it's really become my primary social media home. And it's really wonderful to be able to experience those, to have a feed and to be part of a community that we really own and govern and have built up over years. And it's just, at least in my life, shown the benefits that can come from building social media, building our online experiences through shared ownership and governance.
Yeah, and that, I think, it's super interesting. I appreciate you mentioning that sort of like dual strategy, and there's sort of like a tension between the fix what's there, make something new to prefigure some alternative. I'm curious on that second point about, folks migrating or toward the Mastodon approach. what have you learned in the process of trying to cultivate that community?
A bunch of things, but one is the ways in which there is not one model for shared ownership and governance, right? A lot of times as we've been developing this community, one, we've had to change the structure of the co-op, when it moved from being a few dozen to a few hundred people. And we've had to centralize a little more so that, we know what one another is doing, so that the different working groups actually can talk to each other, not just among each other. And it's also at times some of the problems that have inevitably emerged have made me wonder, okay, how could we do this differently, designing for a different kind of user or a different scale? Our approach is very much a hands-on, very participatory, very volunteer-led cooperative model. I think you could also do a social media cooperative that's much less hands-on, and it's gotten me thinking a lot about, for instance, my credit union that is, the largest mortgage lender in my region. It's where I have my mortgage. I'm glad it's a cooperative. I think that's a good thing. I do want to participate in the Social.coop community. It's been a reminder that we need a kind of diverse mix of structures and styles in a healthy world of shared ownership. And there isn't just one. So in some respects, the kind of challenges we faced have reminded me that we need to get out of kind of one size fits all thinking and recognize that, as with any other kind of organizations, shared ownership organizations need to be able to look and feel really different.
Yeah, interesting. I appreciate that note toward the diversity of practices, not one size fits all. I'm curious, is there maybe an example that comes to mind for you? Would you say there are like effective online communities that are greater scale that maybe like fit the credit union community you're kind of talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at something like Wikipedia or even Mozilla, which is in no way a cooperative, but is kind of a public benefit oriented tech organization, or some large cooperatives like, say, Oclock, which is a big cooperative among university libraries for managing data, large digital cooperative. Or you can think of like REI as a platform co-op. A lot of its sales happen online. It's these are all very low touch organizations in the sense that their users are not participating in them every day, but they still have a sense of being perhaps a kind of represented in the organization. And it's that kind of thing that I think in many respects we might aspire toward. But we need to build an ecosystem where the things that really affect our lives day to day and that are important to us in kind of high touch ways enable us to have high touch participation. And the things that where we just simply need to know that our trust is not being misplaced, that the accountability is appropriate there. I mean, with my credit union, I have met with members of the board. I have once gone to an annual meeting. It's not like I'm totally checked out, but I don't feel the need to do that much because, like my meeting with the board member was really good. And I felt like, okay, you're doing a great job, and you're doing work that I don't want to do. And thank you. And you know that you're ultimately accountable to your members, not to outside shareholders. And I think, there's sometimes a kind of magical thinking around shared ownership that it's like a transcendentally different thing from, say, investor ownership. And so people wonder, how could you possibly share ownership among thousands of people, right? Or even more? Well, we do that with stock ownership every day, with every public company. They are owned by countless people who a stake in them and who they have to be accountable to. And there's a structure of proxy voting and alignment of incentives and things like that to make those companies accountable to those people. And so the problem of widespread shared ownership is actually not a problem. Like it's something we know how to do. The problem, in my view, is that too often we do that with a purely shareholder mindset and structure where companies are purely accountable to financially interested shareholders rather than stakeholders who have an interest in things beyond just the profitability of the company, and a narrow sort of profitability as well. So in some respects, I think this challenge of stakeholder ownership is easier than many people make it out to be. Yeah, and maybe it's not every stakeholder, right? There's a lot of interest right now in like multi-stakeholder structures where you've got, some percentage of shares for your employees, some with users. I'm pretty skeptical of those, although I'm happy to support them when people want to do them. In a sense, a difference in kind of the decision being made. It's just a difference in, who is being prioritized.
Yeah, I totally absolutely see what you mean. Sort of the clarity of like, okay, if we just shift, okay, it's not the shareholder, but it's the employee. Now we've also got a very clear directive. It's just a different it's just a different direction for that clarity.
That's right.
I'm curious. So you mentioned sort of using this example of interviewing someone from your credit union, which I'm hearing is sort of like your personal process of like how you feel comfortable with delegation, because you know that you're delegating to them, sort of showing up as you would hope Nathan would if Nathan were directly engaged in the credit union on a day-to-day kind of basis. Are there other ways that you think about like representative and direct democracy, how people feel comfortable with being in these spaces where like there are so many users and it's so hard to be directly engaged? So we know we're delegating so much. How to feel comfortable with that?
I think there are a few approaches. A lot of people who are into governance like to focus on decisions and votes and things like that. Those are important, but I think they're actually much less important than people sometimes seem to think. Culture is deeply important in organizations. That is a way of shaping them, and employees have a lot of say in shaping culture. And also just structures of alignment. I think a lot of how corporations are set up today is less about like who's voting day to day, but actually like how are incentives aligned. The use of, for instance, stock grants to CEOs is a very powerful tool for aligning CEO interests to shareholders without shareholders having to make a decision to say, do this or do that. It just means like the shareholders can trust that the CEO has their best interests at heart because the interests are the same. So that question of how you organize a company or an organization to be aligned can do, in some respects, a lot more than any one decision. And so, for instance, when we look at employee ownership, one design that we've seen recently is using preferred stock for investment. So you are aligning the investors' interests with the workers' interests. If the workers want to see dividends, want to see profits, they have to make sure the investors are also seeing returns. That alignment is built in, and it's a way of avoiding necessarily having to give those investors direct say in the company, say through voting shares or seats on the board or things like that. The alignment can do that. At the same time, I think there are opportunities to have more high fidelity democracy in our organizations, such as, for instance, using kind of ongoing feedback processes. We see a lot of experimentation with governance mechanisms in these digital organizations built on blockchains using cryptocurrency. I think a lot of the dust has not settled there, but I think there are a lot of really cool opportunities to explore how can some of the experiments that have been developed there, ideas like liquid democracy, where you're able to withdraw the delegation of your vote at any time. You're able to delegate on just certain issues, where you're able to get higher fidelity information about participant preferences. That sort of stuff can be useful. I think also the use of, for instance, citizen assemblies, which are being adopted by governments around the world in many places, including here in my town in Boulder. We're just in the process of starting our first one. These are opportunities where you build essentially a random jury of people in a community that's representative demographically in some way, and have them come together and make recommendations or make decisions. That can be a really powerful tool for getting out of the polarization that sometimes informs voting processes. And there's actually an experiment now going on at Mondragon, the largest network of worker co-ops in the world, applying citizen assemblies within the context of a co-op. I think that sort of thing is really exciting. I do think there's a lot of space for experimentation around decision-making. You don't have to rewrite every rule in the book. It's actually just the key thing is to shift who you're accountable to.
We're thinking about like aligning incentives and creating structures where we're still a bit removed, but we understand that like through the aligning of incentives, we can feel comfortable with deferring, not being so directly engaged, but then also having these more high touch, high fidelity instances like liquid democracy or citizen assemblies as these chances to jump in. I'm curious because we mentioned, you cited Wikipedia as one example, and that's actually something that we're thinking a lot about at Zolidar, and the way that we're kind of thinking about the design of our employee ownership online community for a variety of reasons, so some of which is that we know that, information itself can be so fragmented. So just to have a place to bring employee ownership information together, to keep it fresh. So hopefully it's, there's a sense of ownership in the community of we want this information to be up to date and accurate. And then we take a shared accountability to let's keep it fresh, which can otherwise be so difficult if it's a more traditional relationship to knowledge, more top down. Would you suggest, as we're thinking about the design of Zolidar's online community, things like assemblies of users coming together as a way to talk about the state of, is this information fresh and useful, and applying that kind of practice?
Yeah, but building participatory spaces is really hard. Building any multi-sided market or kind of commons is not easy, and I don't think there's an easy answer to this. And in some respects, I think it's important to recognize that in some respects, they were drawing on the legacy of very top-down models in order to seed the possibility of a more participatory one, because nobody would participate in it unless it mattered, unless there was a clear foundation that this is a commons that we care about and that is already useful, and where the contribution I make is going to be read by people and is going to be informing what other people are doing. In the context of employee ownership, one case that I've had the opportunity to study closely is that of a network here in Colorado that started with an employee-owned solar installer called Namaste Solar. They tried to scale nationally. They didn't end up finding that worked. They wanted to keep the company pretty regional so that they would retain their culture. But they did build out a large purchasing co-op called Amicus Solar that's national. And that's a co-op whose members are small businesses that are solar installers that are buying solar panels together and getting huge discounts in the process. And they've built a really successful, one of the core offerings of that co-op is the online community among the companies that participate in it. And one of the things that I think makes it valuable is that they don't just let anybody in. They're pretty unapologetic about a culture of ethical business, of companies that are really committed to treating their employees well and to being part of a just solar transition. And so they do a lot of vetting, they do a lot of relationship building on the front end. And so when people get into that space, it's a very high quality space. So that's one way of doing it. But just as valid as the strategy of Wikipedia, anyone shows up, but then we're going to really be attentive to who ends up having power. There are all kinds of ways of building these kinds of commons. It's not a one size fits all, but it is about knowing your community and knowing how to align the incentives right so that people have a reason to participate. One thing that I see a lot, and that would you do more? What would you have to do in order to do, what would you have to get or experience or be part of in order to do more? If we want people to participate a lot, they're really getting something out of it. And if we don't actually need them to participate a lot, how do we make sure to design it so that they can still, the accountability is still to them, but they don't have to be there every day?
Hearing you say, let's be really conscious about the design. Yeah, one part of that is sort of the empathy gap that can exist if we thought we designed it for everyday engagement, but we're not getting that. And so that also kind of comes back to how we think about success in these communities, and of course there's metrics to that, but there's also more of maybe an ineffability also too about how exactly do we say a community is successful? I don't know if you wanted to share anything about that.
Well, I think it's really about what is your mission, and what do you need from those participants, and what are you offering back? And that success is something that, the nice thing about a shared ownership model, the challenge and the nice thing is those stakeholders get to decide what success is. In an investor-owned company, success is very clear. It's exceeding market expectations. That's the definition of success. And that's a very powerful definition of success. I don't want to, I think that's important to recognize. That requirement to exceed market expectations can produce a lot of creativity. It can produce a lot of risk taking and in some respects, long-term thinking. And I respect that algorithm, as a formidable tool. And And yet, in the context of, say, an employee-owned business, you have the opportunity for employees to help shape a very different set of goals. And that goal setting is the most important thing, stakeholders can possibly do, is step in and be able to say, what is it that we really want this organization to have as its core purpose. One thing too, though, that I think is important to recognize is that the data around employee ownership specifically makes pretty clear that the real gains from employee ownership aren't going to come from just the ownership. They really need to include both ownership and participation. When you get those two things together, you start to see real significant productivity gains in an organization. So don't take what I'm saying as a kind of license to ignore the cultivation of a community of participation. In some respects, employees, community members of all sorts, they're going to do more, and they're going to be better contributors. They're going to feel more connected to the community if they are participating. But the question is, what does that look like in any given organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for underlining that point. And it's certainly something we've been thinking a lot, and from our own review of the literature ourselves, seeing like just exactly as you say, that like employee ownership as a employee benefit is truly optimized with participation, not mere ownership. It is important, even if it is sort of like the sole access point. But yeah, participation is what really like unlocks that benefit for employees. So as we're thinking about, again, like building this, like Wikipedia is one kind of it's a proxy, of course, we're not building Wikipedia, but sort of an employee ownership knowledge base. We're also thinking about identity in the sort of almost like a social sense, like kind of like what you're saying about Social.coop. Where folks can meet organically, have conversations. So I think an interpretation of what you're saying is that, we should also center participation as kind of the way we talk about employee ownership, and like in the way that we like seed our knowledge base about like the kind of articles you'll find there. Like it should be very intuitive and quick to maybe like see the fact that participation linked with ownership is the true benefit. And that's kind of the way that we can help seed that community effectively, but then also knowing that it kind of takes on a life of its own at that point as well.
Yeah. And it has to also be something that people perceive as trustworthy, and that it is trustworthy, because there's a recognition that sense of ownership is so powerful in creating healthier and more dynamic and creative workplaces. And just imagine how much more we can do with real ownership. There's no one template for what that looks like, just as at the same time, there's a lot to learn.
Yeah, thank you for that. And another thing I wanted to underscore too about sort of like our hypothesis at Zolidar about the relationship about employee ownership and the online community of employee ownership is that we find that part of our hypothesis is that there's a fair amount of fragmentation in terms of the employee ownership space. So it can be really challenging to feel like maybe if I were a small business owner who's going to be using the Zolidar app to help me go through an employee ownership transition, to even get a sense of the landscape of people who maybe are the professionals that could help them, beside even like having a knowledge base where I can go look at articles and I can interact with a chatbot that has been trained for employee ownership to ask lots of questions as a thought partner. That fragmentation effect of like, how do I know who's even out there, who to reach out to? And furthermore, how do I compare them? Is another kind of key question that we're asking, a Zolidar online EO community could help address. So I was curious if that resonates from your experience.
Well, there are directories out there, like NCEO, the National Center on Employee Ownership, has directories of professionals, but there are like more directories out there than we know what to do with. But actually, in some respects, I think that that business in reality kind of happens more organically, and it's in some respects more important to embed knowledge in communities, not simply have lists of them. And it's why I think the genius of the ESOP structure, which is the most widespread tool for employee ownership in the United States, the genius of that is it was designed by a lawyer, Louis Kelso, who designed it in a way that lawyers could make money on, to put it crudely. And when lawyers can make money on stuff, they suggest it to their clients. And same with, Bank of America opened, an ESOP office, not because, their Bank of America is a devoted stakeholder in the employee ownership community. It's because they can make money off of it. And I think that's not something to shy away from. I think ultimately these kinds of things are going to work because the people who are the trusted professionals and trusted guides to any kind of business decision have a stake and have an opportunity to benefit from these kinds of transitions and from these kinds of models. When you have a movement where people are really able to build a livelihood on enabling good things to happen, I think the support structure forms organically. So that's something I think we really need to make sure we're prioritizing rather than simply like finding each other out there. Of course, we don't get to that destination. We don't get to that healthy ecosystem without people who are deeply committed, who are going to be there no matter what, whether they get paid for it or not. I see myself as part of that community. I think you are. I think a lot of us building now are in that category. But I think we're not going to get very far unless we build for people who aren't like us.
Right. I mean, certainly, yeah. We just look right at the raw numbers of we got 6,500 ESOPs, maybe somewhere between 700 to 1,000 worker co-ops. Yeah, scale is certainly something we think a lot about. At least in terms of the deliberate sense of that, right? Not just scale for scale's sake, but so I think to your point is like there is so much of the American population who've never heard about employee ownership, who have thus never participated in employee ownership in any way. And, it's up to us as those who are like maybe some say early adopters or evangelists, as you say, like kind of you and I might fall in that place to design, like for us, an online community that is, a technology layer that makes participation fun, makes it easy, attractive, lets people organize organically to embed their own knowledge, to co-create and take it in the direction that they truly need it to go, for us to actually tap into that sort of bigger, like the middle of America in the sense of like a bell curve, right? For like how much adoption do we have of employee ownership? We just have to do our best to make a container where that's possible, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think, there's also some structural challenges that we need for expanding this model. I mean, the tools that we have are still quite limited, and I think we are struggling to compete not just on awareness, but on kind of benefit. And a lot of the work in employee ownership conversions, happened goes back to the early years after the ESOP was created in 1974. The numbers of ESOPs of employee owners has been relatively stable over the years, and I don't think that's simply an awareness problem. I think it's that there are too many businesses where the calculation just doesn't work out. It may be that your tools can show us, actually, there's a whole set of businesses out there where this makes a lot of financial sense and they really just don't know about it. That may be the case. My suspicion is that if employee ownership were a superior option for a lot more companies right now, for a lot more sellers right now, we would be seeing more of them. We would see the market pick that up. And I'm not a market absolutist, but I tend to think that my riding assumption right now is that we are in a position where the incentives are not strong enough, where the incentives currently are too strong for selling to private equity, for selling to investor ownership and exploitation, and they're not strong enough for employee ownership. So a lot of my focus right now is on identifying the strategies we need at a policy level to make a difference. Just recognizing small opportunities that could make a big difference to ensure that employee ownership is a more attractive option.
Yeah, and thanks for talking about kind of how you're thinking about strategy here. I mean, certainly we've seen employee ownership favoring legislation. I can only imagine you were probably pretty involved with how progressive Colorado is in this regard. Colorado is certainly a leader, and we're seeing, of course, the EEIA, which is the Employee Equity Investment Act, I believe was what that stands for. So we're seeing various initiatives, other states too. California fairly recently passing employee ownership favoring policy changes. I'm curious about how do you see maybe the intersection between the technology and like a Zolidar and changes in policy? Like we have our own sort of hypothesis about how we can tap into that, but maybe you have thoughts around that.
Yeah, technology has a really interesting relationship with policy. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. I've been developing this concept of innovation amnesia, which is a process where we actually often seem to forget policy structures in the face of new technologies? Are there ways in which a new technology could actually change the ground for employee ownership? Could we use technologically mediated tools to enable more shared ownership? One place that I've been working on this is the kind of much maligned blockchain universe, which I've been really interested in because it's a technology of ownership, and it creates the opportunity to really redesign how we structure ownership by using digital contracts that are self-enforcing. But one thing that we've seen happen for a few years in the in the kind of late 2010s, there was that sense of possibility that, we can really reinvent organizations using this technology.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections. And, it's really one of the things where even goes back to the naming of this podcast, that we chose Bicycle for the EO Mind because we have this view that so I'm gonna get this right. So, it's the human being, of course, is so central to that. And, for us, that the way that we're thinking about employee ownership and the way that, the advisors and the small business owners and the technology hopefully come together in this incredibly mutually reinforcing ecosystem, but also, a technology layer that supports the ability for transactions to be successful, by virtue of being, a software application we also hope has much further reach than a lot of, say, maybe our, existing nonprofit infrastructure has been able to reach. Maybe more. We can hopefully reach more businesses than have been reached previously to get the informational out. But then, of course, we exist in this investor-owned preferential ecosystem that is the sort of superstructure of all these things happening. So that's always kind of, in our minds as well. So yeah, I guess what I'm getting at here is, that we want the technology to be ultimately supercharging. We've used this analogy of Iron Man, the Iron Man suit is the way to supercharge the humans who are involved and to make it to where the technology feels truly like thought partnership as small business owners go through this type of transition. I'm just curious, how do you see that potentially evolving that way? And is that maybe part of a key to there being this idea of tech for good, that we situate the human, that we center the human, but sort of supercharge them in some way?
Well, I think of, the case I mentioned before, the community of around Amicus Solar, which again is a purchasing cooperative whose members are small solar companies around the U.S. and into Mexico and elsewhere. And one thing that I think is very powerful about that network is it's actually enabled several member companies to become employee owned because it built a community of trust and of knowledge and elevated, and gave people an experience of a cooperative model that they came to trust and benefit from. So they took a step and embraced this approach in ways that they probably wouldn't have otherwise. And if you could, as I mentioned, that's a very slow and high trust network. If technology can enable that kind of trust to move faster and to reach more people and more industries, I think it can make a difference. And I think the question is too, how do you make sure that people are getting value from the project on day one? You want to join this one because it's going to save you money, and then 5 years down the line, you're going to have developed trust with all these people that you're saving money with, and realize, actually this employee ownership thing is for real, where they are actually seeing the benefits start to happen in their lives. Again, it begins with, putting yourself in the shoes of the users and recognizing what is it that would make me actually be willing to take the risk and walk in the store.
Yeah, so that dropped in my mind, Nathan, this idea of thinking about a small business owner joining the Zolidar online community, and then maybe by virtue of the fact that we've already learned what industry they're in, they receive as part of their launch page a video of here's an owner like them that's gone through a transition, and then they're talking about their experience of it, right? And they're describing these things that say this is why it worked from a human emotional perspective. It felt really good. It preserved my legacy. I knew I was doing well by my people. It preserved my mission, and also did well by me financially. I got a fair market liquidity event out of it, and they could hear those things simultaneously and in this relevant, easily trustable, probably sense of well, that's an owner like me. It seems that could be a way that technology could help, still moving at the speed of trust, but a slightly faster speed of trust.
Yeah, no. And I think also just knowing that there's a community of people who can help carry them. I have a lot of interactions with people exploring transitions for their companies. I'm chatting with people almost every day who are working through this, and just answering questions and pointing them to others and that sort of thing. And I think a really important challenge is just knowing that okay, if I do this, like I don't want to be alone, and I need to have the trust that there's going to be someone to help answer my question, and maybe someone who I don't have to pay $600 an hour for. And so I think there's that sense of even the promise that if you do this, a community is going to help carry you. A community is going to, you're going to be able to, post your questions and get good answers and be able to develop relationships with others, learn best practices. A lot of people come in with a lot of fear about like, oh, am I going to have to like totally reinvent everything that I've built because I'm adopting a new model? And just knowing that there are lots of other people who they can access who've done this is important. So yeah, my most recent book is called Governable Spaces, and it's about governance in online life. And a big part of the story of it is actually just recognizing that in online spaces, we've kind of departed from a lot of things that we have done offline in a lot of different kinds of contexts. When we come together, set a few ground rules for how we're going to do it. When we're forming a new community, be explicit about how power flows. Make it clear. Don't be afraid of it. Don't hide behind it. And another piece of this that I think that really came to the fore for me is I set out to do a book this time not about shared ownership, but just about democratic governance. I really tried to avoid the question of ownership, but it came back. And in the historical story, I learned through my research was that really the lack of shared ownership of things like servers of tech companies is a profound driver for why we don't experience a lot of democratic life in those contexts. And that extends down to like just a small community of people coming together around a shared interest, not just like the big companies and how they're structured. So it really persuaded me once again that ownership matters and that we can't really get around that. And that if we want to build more democratic societies and projects that are really able to be accountable to the people they serve and to harness the creativity of the people they serve, we do really have to bring ownership into the mix, and employee ownership is one of the really powerful tools for doing that. Well, I think one question to raise with you all is just what your own trajectory is. What kind of trust people can have in the platform itself. Is there a way that people can, when they come into it, to talk about shared ownership? And it would be really powerful to see a project like Zolidar that is building around shared ownership.
Just to lay it out for our timeline, I mean, we've just launched as of last month. So if future listeners are listening to this, September 2024 was our launch. So we're quite early in the journey, but we have defined 5 different milestones in our blog. We are absolutely co-designing the future as we build. And yeah, thank you so much, Nathan, for your time today.
Thank you, Matthew. It's always good to be with you. Thanks for the work you're doing.
Take care.